Welcome to the module, Handling Returns, Corrections, and Cancellations. We have covered a few different types of receiving exceptions in the last module, including handling partial receiving, price changes, and substitutions. In this module, we are going to go over how to handle returns, corrections, and cancellations in Birch Street. First, let's provide a simple definition for each. A return or correction means the receiver discovered some of the items logged as received in the system need to be returned or corrected. The returns can result from the physical return of damaged goods and correction for data entry mistakes made by the Birch Street receiver. A cancellation occurs when either all or a portion of the purchase order is marked as canceled in Birch Street by the receiver. Cancellations usually result from back orders or delays in delivery dates. Let's use a couple of scenarios to illustrate these topics in Birch Street. Note: returns, corrections, and cancellations must be completed before the invoice is processed in Birch Street. Once the invoice has been processed, the receiver can no longer make these changes. If you are not able to make the changes, please notify the AP user. We are going to introduce George, the engineering admin for the property. George takes care of all the Birch Street electronic receiving for the engineering department. For today's example, George has logged the Birch Street receiving for the air filter purchase order. The receiving was done without any exceptions, and George continued with his daily work. The filters were taken by the engineer on duty. A few hours later, the engineer notified George that 2 of the filters received were damaged. George reached out to the supplier to inform them about the damaged filters. The supplier agreed to provide the property with an invoice adjustment for the damaged filters. At this point, the problem is solved outside of Birch Street. However, in Birch Street, we have already received the order in full. As a result, the system still shows the property is in possession of the full quantity of air filters. George must now go into Birch Street and adjust the receiving event in order to reflect the return. To make the adjustment in Birch Street, George will first locate the purchase order. George can search by purchase order number or any of the options under the search drop-down. He can see the purchase order is in the receiving complete status, since he had previously received this purchase order in full. To log the return, he can click on the Receive button. George can input the received date and then click on the Line Items tab to make the return adjustments. In the Accepted Quantity field, he can input the quantity returned as a negative number. In this example, George can enter -2 for the HD filters. George is essentially removing the 2 items from the delivery that was previously received in full. To complete the return, he can click on the Receive button. At this point, the purchase order will be in a partially received status since the returned items were backed out of the original receiving event. Now, depending on what the supplier does next, George can either cancel or receive the remaining quantity. If the supplier decides to provide an adjusted invoice, George can cancel the remaining quantity. If the supplier agrees to send replacements for the damaged filters, George can log the remaining quantity as received once they have been delivered. In some cases, canceling an entire purchase order might be necessary. Let's illustrate this with another example. In this scenario, the chief engineer, Ben, submitted a purchase order for chemical supplies. Soon after ordering, he realized the supplies weren't needed. Now the chief engineer needs to cancel the order with the supplier. To optionally expedite the cancellation, he can call the supplier and notify them directly. He will also then need to cancel the purchase order in Birch Street. If he does not cancel the purchase order in Birch Street, it will remain open and the spend will be incorrectly reflected in the checkbook. To cancel the purchase order, Ben can locate the purchase order and click on the Receive button. Here, Ben can take the same first step as he would when logging a normal receiving event. He will input today's date in the Received Date field. The Cancel Reason Code field is required for canceling an entire PO. However, for cancellations, Ben doesn't have to go into the Line Items tab. Instead, he will need to look up a valid cancellation reason using the magnifying glass next to the Cancel Reason Code field. He will select the code corresponding to the appropriate reason for the cancellation. Once the reason has been selected, Ben will click on the Cancel PO button. A prompt will ask Ben to confirm the cancellation. Clicking on the OK button will cancel this purchase order. The purchase order status will now be displayed as buyer canceled, and the charge will be removed from the checkbook. Let's summarize what we have learned so far. When receiving damaged or unwanted items, receivers can make a return or correction in Birch Street by creating a negative receiving event. The receiver will need to finalize the purchase order after the negative receiving event. If the supplier agrees to provide an adjusted invoice, cancel the remaining quantity. If the supplier will send replacements, log the remaining quantity as received once they are delivered. Receivers can also cancel an entire purchase order by selecting the appropriate Cancel Reason code and clicking on the Cancel PO button in the receiving screen. Make sure to only use the Cancel PO function if canceling the entire purchase order.